Hiya folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness, joining me for another episode of Strange Tales. Today I want to return to the subject of A Clockwork Orange. I've discussed this film in a previous video with regards to the mind control illusions in the film and how that may have tied into some of the more real mind control that's gone on in the world over the history. But today I want to talk about the UK banning of A Clockwork Orange. There are a number of narratives that have gone along with this idea of the film being banned in the UK. One was that the film was banned by Kubrick himself. Another one was that the film was banned via censorship in the UK and the UK government was involved with that as well. There are some other narratives that, although the official narrative is that either the Kubrick and or censorship involvement was the main thrust of that narrative, that there were some agendas that were going on underneath the reason behind the film being banned in the UK. But I'm going to come to that in a moment. Now, A Clockwork Orange was released in the US in 1971, December of 1971, soon after in February 1972 in the UK. In many regards, the film was critically applauded for its depiction of the idea of social engineering and state control of the mind, and it was perceived by many as being a cautionary tale about where society was going, about dystopias and that kind of subject matter. But within that remit of storytelling was also the ultra-violence of the film, and this seemed to be a serious problem for a number of people viewing the film. Now, very early on after the film was released, it had some form of censorship, some form of banning all over the world, various places around the world. In America, the film was given an X rating. In Singapore, the film was banned for over 30 years. In South Africa, it was banned for over 13 years under apartheid. In Brazil, the film was banned under military dictatorship until 1978. But what's most interesting is what happened in the UK. Now, the film was passed uncut for UK cinema in December of 1971. According to official sources on it, was the British authorities that considered the sexual violence in the film to be too extreme. As far as the official narrative goes, it was during March of 1972 that there was the trial of a 14-year-old boy accused of the manslaughter of a classmate, and that his crime was inspired by a scene in the film. And this is where we're starting to see this idea of a connection between pop culture and violence. The defence counsel of the trial at the time actually referred to the link between this crime and sensational literature, particularly A Clockwork Orange, is established beyond reasonable doubt. And this is something that would obviously go on throughout the 80s particularly. I'll come to that in a moment. At the time, many people actually believed that it was Warner Brothers who'd banned the film, and some other people believed that it was the UK government that banned the film. Much later on in years, although it was known at the time, but it became more known in the mainstream, the official narrative then became that Kubrick had actually banned the film, that he'd gone to Warner Brothers and done this. There was this talk about copycat attacks that were going on at the time. There was a television documentary that was made where his widow, Christiane Kubrick, basically said that Kubrick had withdrawn the film on police advice after threats that were made against Kubrick and his family, but the source of the threat was not discussed. In the history of Hollywood, it's not completely unheard of, but it is extremely rare, almost unheard of actually, I would say, for a film director to have that much power to be able to withdraw their own film. And it only ever really tends to happen if the film is a flop, and even then the decision's usually made by the entities, usually the film studio, but there are other financial entities as well, that finance the film. Now, Clockwork Orange was a critical and commercial success. It garnered numerous awards. It lined the financial pockets of Warner Brothers very, very nicely indeed. And at the time, Britain, after America, was a key source of box office income for Hollywood. And it raises this question, I've often asked this question, to assume that Warner Brothers simply asked no questions and that they agreed to the ban. That even if they were made aware of this idea that something had been going on, that there had been some threats made against Kubrick's family, would that be enough for them to completely remove that revenue stream from the UK for them? And like I say, there aren't many people in Hollywood who've ever been able to do that. But this is Stanley Kubrick we're talking about. And if you look into Stanley Kubrick and the ideas behind the films that he made, the connections he might have had, the deals that might have been cut with him to do things, and people have ruminated about 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick's connections to NASA, and the Apollo moon missions, we shall say, which I've talked about in other videos, or other videos to come as well. The themes that were put into Eyes Wide Shut as well. But let's get back to A Clockwork Orange now, because in the late 1970s, Anthony Burgess was interviewed. Now, Anthony Burgess was the novelist of the book that Kubrick based his film on. And Burgess maintained that the reason why there had been such a negative reaction to the film was because of how Kubrick had not included the final chapter that was originally put in the book. Certainly it's a book that you would buy in the UK, and it was the 21st chapter of the book, and it was a hopeful chapter, and it talked about how Alex, the central character, had reformed himself. He had a son, and he'd given up his life of violence and that kind of thing. Now, Kubrick said that he'd been given the film, I think it was during the making of 2001, he'd been given the book, but this was an American copy of the book. Now, the American version of the book omitted the final hopeful chapter. This was the version that Kubrick worked with when he was building his screenplay for A Clockwork Orange. And he said that he wasn't actually aware of this 21st hopeful final chapter until almost the end of production of A Clockwork Orange, and it was too late to do anything about it. But Burgess maintained that it was the non-inclusion of that final chapter that caused a lot of the problems where A Clockwork Orange was concerned, the film. And in the 1999 UK documentary, Still Ticking, The Return of A Clockwork Orange, he said, "I became associated with violence because of the film. If a couple of nuns were, I won't use the word, but it begins with R, in Berwick-on-Tweed, I would always get a phone call from the newspaper. 'Mr. Burgess, what do you think?' They would never telephone you, Stanley, because you keep out the way." And Burgess had more to say on the matter, and he actually did go down a bit of a rabbit hole with this one. He said that both the US release of his novel and Kubrick's film adaptation that omitted the final hopeful chapter were designed that way to fit a US-centric socio-political agenda. And this is what he said on the matter. "What was really wanted was a Nixonian work with no shred of optimism in it. Let us all have evil prancing up to the very last line, sneering in the face of all the inherited beliefs, Jewish, Christian, Muslim and Holy Roller, about people being able to make themselves better." Kubrick was often at odds with the way Burgess had interpreted his cinematic adaptation of his novel. Burgess portrayed himself as the proverbial good guy to Kubrick's bad guy. And it's interesting that Kubrick depicts the writer in A Clockwork Orange as a victim earlier in the film, then later on as the perpetrator of violence towards his former attacker. One of the things that comes out of Kubrick's version of A Clockwork Orange is this idea of proverbial dark hero at the centre of a story. And that actually became something of a boon for Kubrick, because A Clockwork Orange popularised and mainstreamed that idea of, I know the idea of an anti-hero had always been around, but it really thrust it into the mainstream. And from there you can see the effects of that paradigm echoing down the decades, and particularly today in things like TV shows like Dexter and Breaking Bad and things like that. And that mainstreaming has sizably neutered the powerful message that's at the heart of A Clockwork Orange, turning its themes and imagery into basically cheap gimmicks. I mean, there's no more obvious example of that if you look around and you look at the amount of celebrities and musicians and pop stars and things like that who've put the Alex DeLarge garb on as easily as anybody else puts on any type of clothing. You know, they just wear it as if it doesn't mean anything at all. Certainly if you look into the way the music industry works, it may be that there's a more sinister motive behind that, which ties in nicely actually to this idea that a number of alternative knowledge researchers have. You see it quite often if you look on forums on the internet, things like that, where people talk about so-called conspiracies, or equally as much as they talk about Hollywood as well, believing that this idea that A Clockwork Orange had an agenda to it, and that Kubrick was tasked with inserting certain agenda aspects into the film. Because actually, if you look at A Clockwork Orange, it's loaded with esoteric symbolism. It's all over it. As well as narrative tropes about social engineering, state power, mind control, propaganda, all that kind of thing. And that brings us back to what was actually happening in the UK in the early 70s with the banning of the film. And this other idea of government collusion. The Home Secretary of the Conservative government at the time was Reginald Morley. He was alleged to have played a part, and I do have some documentation on that. And the UK press seemingly associated a number of these instances of violent crimes to the film, claiming that individuals had aped the mannerisms and the behaviour of Alex and his gang of droogs. There was this fierce backlash against the film at that point from UK parliamentary figures and mainstream media watchdogs. Other agencies involved themselves in this idea of official censorship of UK films. And the whole affair seemed to stoke the fire of film censorship, echoing on into the early 1980s at that point. One of the things that I came across was in the latter part of 1982, rumbling through into 1983, was how the UK government were really clamping down on the British Film Classification Board, and there was a lot of campaigns to do with video nasties and sadism and things like that. And by the beginning of 1983, April 1983, I think it was Norbert Abbott of the BVA was expressing these fears of growing hysteria that were being whipped up by portions of the press. At that point, it was about a voluntary classification scheme. But then that didn't happen. The government decided upon this across the board bill. It's known that there were many VHS pirate copies of the film that were brought into the UK from France, where the film ban wasn't in place. The video nasty phenomenon at that point itself, it's a decidedly murky affair. It was invading thinly veiled attempts by the UK government to police the burgeoning home video market at that point in time. This ability to be able to record things off television, and how that would affect copyright and things like that, and how people that could then start having more choice in the way they watched, which would have been a real threat at the time to the state broadcasters, like the BBC and things like that. Obviously got commercial as well, ITV and that, and think around about that time was just coming along was Channel 4 as well in the UK, and so you were then starting to open up avenues of being able to explore your entertainment and by extension your information about the world from other places other than just the state broadcaster or the government's front line of broadcastability in a country. And it played a significant role in the legacy of what was left of the 20th century and 21st century copyright laws. I mean, we see it today with copyright online. Also, I would argue that if you look at the way this film was tackled in terms of its banning, you had this idea of criminality in society. Also the involvement of people who are vulnerable in society. You can't help but look at things like the online harms paper at the moment that we have involving itself in complete and total censorship and deplatforming of people online, being done under the guise of specifically protecting children and protecting vulnerable people, which I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree that there should be a mechanism in place run by these bodies to help protect children and vulnerable people online, but not as a backdoor means to get in massive online censorship and propaganda, that kind of thing, which is already rampant in the mainstream media, which is why online has been a threat to the mainstream media and to governments alike for a long time, and we're seeing the ramifications of that now. But we can see the birth of this back in the 1980s, and it is inextricably tied to A Clockwork Orange, and the origins of that furor seem to be mired in speculation, but it's uncertain if there actually were any real crimes that were committed that were wholly inspired by the film itself. The 1999 documentary Still Ticking, The Return of A Clockwork Orange, Robin Duvall, who was then director of the British Board of Film Classification, said, "There were allegations that had invited or stimulated some yob gangs. What we don't know at this instance is how true that was. I mean, there's, as a regulator over a very long period of time, one thing I've learned is that it's not uncommon for somebody who finds themselves in the dock to say, well, Gov, it's not my fault. I saw this movie or TV programme and I was led to it by what I saw. And it's quite possible there was an element of that with A Clockwork Orange." Now, the producers of that documentary, they attempted to interview Edward Heath and Jack Straw. Both, allegedly, according to some researchers, helped in some manner to encourage the aforementioned public outcry, but they actually declined to be interviewed for the documentary. Then we have the film being withdrawn from circulation in the UK, and it's from there on that the story becomes really quite strange, because for years afterwards, fingers were being pointed in numerous directions, blaming all and sundry for the effective banning of the film. Bearing in mind, at a later date, it was said that it was Kubrick had banned the film, but I've often wondered whether that was a cover for a much bigger thing that was going on in the UK. And naturally, when you look at these things, there are a lot of claims, and I do think there's some validity to this. There are a lot of claims that that whole paradigm surrounding A Clockwork Orange was actually an experiment in social engineering, and it was designed to generate cultural backlash that would actually encourage individuals to embrace greater degrees of depravity and violence in television and film. And this is where we get back to this idea of Kubrick may being involved, because it's possible that Kubrick was actually utilised to further any and all of those agendas. Unfortunately, we don't know that for certain. There's no way of really knowing that for sure. So as time rattled on, it was really 1999 and the death of Kubrick that solidified the official narrative on these things. One of the things that happened was that Christiane Kubrick said that she was confirming that this idea that it was Kubrick that had banned the film himself. There were strange stories actually about how Kubrick was feeling very threatened. I mean, there are a lot of stories actually that portray Kubrick at moments here and there within his life as being a bit paranoid in the way he lived his life and the way he did things. There are stories about how he used to walk around his estate with a shotgun in the middle of the night looking for intruders and things like that. Some people have said that that came off the back of the threats that were made to his family over Clockwork Orange. If those claims were true, who knows? Only at this point in time, it would probably just be Christian Kubrick that would know for certain about that. Kubrick would have known, but obviously he's no longer with us. There was also a claim that Kubrick had been thinking about ending the ban of the film in the months, probably about 6 to 12 months before he died, in the lead up to that point. But that never actually happened. According to the film critic Alexander Walker at the time, he tried to basically confirm this idea that Kubrick was visited by Hertfordshire police and warned about, quote, the power of the film and how, quote, real droogs could turn up on his doorstep to threaten his wife and children. Slightly different from what was said previous to that, because there were a number of accounts that the police actually did tell him of credible threats, tangible threats that had been made. At this point, Alexander Walker was saying that the possibility. So it's worth considering all these things. It isn't just a case of, I don't think at least anyway, it isn't just as a case of copycat criminality, bad behaviour in society and things like that, that was a threat. I think there's much more here about, like the film actually, this idea of social engineering, social transformation and that kind of thing. You actually have Alex DeLarge becoming part of a state-run propaganda government psyop at the end of the film. And I've often wondered if this is what we're dealing with where A Clockwork Orange is concerned. I've talked about this before, how the messages of mind control in the film, it might be based on real mind control and things like that. There's a possibility that the film may have been used for specific agendas, specific to the UK. People have talked about maybe that this was across the world agenda where that film was concerned, and the reason why he decided that he didn't want the film to be in the UK was because the UK was then his beloved home and he didn't want that agenda rolling out in the UK, so he thought, oh, I'll put the film out there, but now I'm going to ban it so that whatever that agenda might have been in the film won't happen in the UK. But of course history's told us differently, you know, with things like that. So who knows? A lot of speculation there really at the end of this video.
So why did they ban chocolate orange?
As always with Strange Tales, I'll leave it for you to decide what you think. Please let me know in the comments what your take on this is. If you know, I'd be interested to hear what people think. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like, share, subscribe. I truly appreciate that. If you're interested in my alternative knowledge research, you can check out my books. They're available from Lulu Publishing and Amazon.com. The links to which are available in the description for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon. Bye-bye for now.